Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I've received lots of requests in the last few days to review a particular fight scene for my movie fight reviews playlist on Schola Gladiatoria channel. A fight that I'm going to tell you about in a very second, but before I do that I just want to make sure, if you're not up to date with Game of Thrones, the TV series, stop watching now if you don't want to be spoiled. What we're going to talk about here will absolutely, definitely contain spoilers. So just turn off now and maybe come back and watch the video when you have seen it. But this is episode 3 of season 6 Game of Thrones, and this is a fight which has generated a lot of discussion on the internet. As many of my viewers will know, I do a relatively regular movie fight review segment on my channel, and I've been asked to review this fight. It has motivated a lot of different emotions in people. Some people really loved it, some people hated it, some people just had interesting points to make about it. So let's go on and look at a few aspects of this fight. So first up, this fight has been expected for quite a while now, and there's been a lot of anticipation for it. It is essentially a young Ned Stark going to the Tower of Joy to attempt to rescue, as he thinks, his sister Lyanna Stark, who has been imprisoned there, he thinks, by Rhaegar Targaryen. And the tower is being defended by the best swordsman in Westeros, essentially, Sir Arthur Dayne. Sir Arthur Dayne is supposed to be the best swordsman of his age. Ned Stark is supposed to be a very competent fighter, and legend has it that Ned defeated Arthur Dayne in combat. Now, of course, what we see happens here is maybe a bit different from that, and this is the revelation of the fight. But what I'm going to do is talk about the fight as a fight from the perspective of someone who teaches historical combat systems based on historical treatises. So the kind of swords that they're using, I teach on a weekly, in fact twice a weekly basis, and have done for nearly 15-20 years now. So I'm looking at it from the perspective of someone who more or less knows how to use these weapons adequately and has knowledge of history and armour and such like, so looking at it from that point of view. There are a couple of things I want to say about this fight that were the things that elicited the most comments, at least on my channel, to begin with, before we even look at the fighting. Firstly, that there is a helmet. Well, pretty obvious to most of you, I hope, but this is something that I rant about on my movie fight reviews, and just generally on my videos on my channel, is that helmets aren't featured enough in movies and TV shows. And in a medieval or pseudo-medieval fantasy setting, a helmet, if you can only afford one piece of armour, a helmet is what it should be, okay? Protecting your head, just as we see in World War I soldiers or modern soldiers, protecting your head, having a helmet, is very fundamental to functioning as a soldier. And I was really pleased to see two of the protagonists in this fight scene wearing helmets. At last, we've got people wearing helmets. And you know, famously in Game of Thrones, the Hound has got a very characteristic style of helmet, and we've only seen it a couple of times right at the beginning when the series began. And I think that's a real shame, because one of the things that characterises the characters in the books is their styles of helmets. And helmets are important. In any kind of medieval armoured setting, a helmet is very, very important. So I won't go on and on about it, but great to see helmets. The second thing which came up was the discussion about dual wielding. Now, I've spoken quite a bit about dual wielding in the past. Dual wielding was done historically. It wasn't done an awful lot. Why, I hear you cry? Well, quite simply, in most combat situations, using two swords is not as good in a battlefield situation as using a sword and a shield, for example. A shield protects you from arrows and thrown spears and things like this, and you can stand in a shield wall with it. Two swords, it doesn't really work very well in a massed combat situation. It doesn't protect you from missile weapons. It's kind of useless if you're standing there in a battle line in battle with two swords, because you'll just be hit by an arrow or a spear or whatever, and it doesn't help those around you. Shields do. Or equally, you'd be using a pole weapon, such as a spear, a bill, a halberd, a glaive, something like this, and of course that is more effective than dual wielding with swords. Someone with a halberd or a glaive or a bill has a big advantage, generally speaking, over someone with two swords, or indeed with one sword. The other thing, of course, is if you're going to wear a sword, wearing two swords is a massive pain in the butt. Given that swords are very often backup weapons to a missile weapon such as a crossbow, or a pole weapon such as a spear or a halberd, if you're wearing the sword as a backup, wearing two of them, and you might not even use them because they're backup weapons, is just kind of superfluous. Now, just to caveat that, yes, two sword fighting styles were done. Some people call it Florentine in the modern world, which is hilariously stupid given that the only Italian or the most well-known Italian sources that we have featuring twin sword dual wielding are actually from Bologna. They're Bolognese, so they're not Florentine at all. They're not from Florence. They're actually from Bologna. So the Bolognese sources, Marozzo and Manciolino, they do talk about the use of two swords together, and it was done in a dueling format. So I have no problem at all with Sir Arthur Dayne using two swords in this scene, as we're going to see in a minute. The only thing to say about it, and I know some people have complained, Sir Arthur Dayne had a famous sword, and it was supposed to be a great sword or a two-handed sword, perhaps a big long sword. And there is a sword shown here which could be that sword, but the dual wielding thing is not mentioned in the books. Now, I don't read the books, so I don't care about that. Do I have a problem with dual wielding in this fight scene? No, I don't. It was something that was done, and in this situation, Sir Arthur Dayne has to fight against multiple opponents, so it makes some kind of sense. So with less waffling from me, let's actually move on and watch the fight. I'll stop it at certain points and talk about certain things that we can see.
Sir Arthur Dayne?
The sword of the morning.
Father said he was the best swordsman he ever saw.
Sir Arthur Dayne, the best swordsman that Ned Stark ever saw. And what does he do with his favourite longsword? He jams it in the ground. Now, I've talked about this in previous videos. If you spend a lot of time, or your servant spends a lot of time, meticulously sharpening your sword so that it will be as effective as possible, you do not then go and stuff it into some stony ground, okay? You're going to chip the blade, blunt the blade. It's just a generally stupid thing to do, and why do it? You presumably have a scabbard for that sword, stick it in the scabbard. So I hate it when they stick swords in the ground. Please don't do it, please move directors, just stop doing it. Anyway, let's carry on with actually getting to the fight.
Lord Stark?
I looked for you on the Trident.
We weren't there.
Your friend, the usurper, would lie beneath the ground if we had been.
The Mad King is dead. Rhaegar lies beneath the ground. Why weren't you there to protect your prince?
Our prince wanted us here.
Where's my sister?
I wish you good fortune in the wars to come. And now it begins.
So an interesting detail there. First of all, he put his helmet on. Fantastic. I wish they all had helmets and put their helmets on. But as we can see, Ned Stark and Howland Reed and buddies are fairly lightly equipped. They're not really wearing much armour. I'll talk a little bit more about armour in a minute. Interesting to see that Sir Arthur Dayne and his buddy are wearing degree of armour. They're wearing breastplates with pauldrons and helmets. It's interesting that interesting to me anyway, that they chose to not put any armour on their arms. I suspect that this is for choreography purposes, because they could get the actors or the stuntmen to fight faster and move faster and more fluidly with wearing a little bit less armour. I think that was a little bit disappointing, because you think about it for a second, they've got armoured heads, armoured bodies, but completely unarmoured arms. Now, in swordsmanship, when we're sparring, the most common place to get hit for anybody is hands and forearms, pretty much, okay? So the fact that they were just wearing leather gloves and forearms means that despite the fact they've got this armour on their torso and heads, they're actually very vulnerable, because think about this, if you put a sword blow into someone's hand, it disables them. It certainly disables that hand, okay? If you put a sword blow into the forearm, having done experiments with freshly killed meat, I can assure you it does not take a very powerful blow with a sharp sword to cut through a wrist or a forearm, certainly to disable it. Very, very easy with a sharp sword. So it seems foolhardy of them to only have armour there and not on their arms. Pretty important to have, especially gauntlets as well. But what I would say is notice also that when he drew the swords, he'd stuffed one of his swords, his long sword, in the ground, and he had another sword actually worn on the hip. This has a historical precedent. We know that sometimes in the 14th, 15th centuries, men-at-arms did have a long sword which was sometimes worn, or carried rather, on the saddle bow of the horse, and they wore what was known as an arming sword, because it's the sword that you arm yourself with that you wear, at their side, a shorter sword, a one-handed sword. But interesting that he took the long sword in the right hand, as you would expect. If that's his dominant hand, he'd take the bigger weapon in the right hand. But he drew the shorter sword from the left side with his left hand. This is not easy to do, and famously Roman legionaries used to wear the gladius on the left hand side and draw it on the right hand side and draw it with their right hand. He's doing the same thing mirrored. He's drawing with the left hand from the left side. So it is an interesting little thing for those of us who handle swords a lot and draw them out of scabbards. It's interesting. It looks different to what we're used to seeing. We're used to seeing people draw a sword across their body, and he drew it on the same side of the body. An interesting little detail. Let's carry on and watch the fight.
No. Now it ends.
Okay, so interesting detail here. First of all, we saw Arthur Dayne immediately go into dual wielding. He was doing lots of spinning around. I don't have a problem with that. It looks good on film, and of course, if you're possibly engaging with multiple opponents and you don't know which one is going to attack you first, moving the weapons around like this potentially keeps numerous people occupied. So it kind of makes some kind of martial sense. But an interesting detail I noticed here. So here's one of Stark's men. I don't know his name. And you'll notice he has what we call a coat of plates. If you've ever wondered what that armour is that you see Ned Stark wearing a lot, on the outside you can see it has kind of rectangular plates with rivet heads showing through. That's known as a coat of plates, and it was a type of armour that came about in the 13th century, became very popular in the 14th century, and it was worn over the top of mail. It was to make chainmail armour more resistant against certain types of weapons, especially arrows and lances and things like this. But interesting thing here, we can see the sword has penetrated with a thrust. That's good. Cuts do not go through armour, generally speaking. Cuts, you can't realistically cut through mail. You can. It's difficult to cut through gambeson, and you cannot cut through plate armour. Okay, so swords used against armour are used to thrust. So brilliant, they have actually thrust. However, my criticism, or where the need to suspend disbelief if you know about this kind of thing, is he has thrust a sword through. We have coat of plates, padded jacket of some kind, gambeson, then we have mail, chainmail, sleeve, which presumably is a full shirt, and then we have clothes underneath. So that sword has penetrated through coat of plates, gambeson, chainmail shirt, and clothes. Unlikely, okay, very unlikely. In real terms, if you were aiming to thrust your sword through someone who's wearing armour, you would aim at a part where armour isn't, which they do later, which is really good, and I'll point that out. Okay, so little bit unrealistic there, but at least it is a thrust. At least they're not just hitting armour with cuts, as we see in so many shows, which just in reality doesn't do anything. So let's carry on with the fight. Hooray! We finally have someone using a thrust to stab where the armour isn't. This is what armoured fighting is actually about. Yes, he's not a fully armoured person. He could have thrust in here between the plates. Indeed, as I mentioned before, he could have cut on the person's arms, because these guys don't have any armour on their arms, stupidly. But anyway, it's absolutely fantastic to see. Yes, he's got a helmet. Yes, he's got a cuirass or breastplate, and the thrust is aimed at the neck. as it should be. And interesting as well, you can see Ned Stark's hand there. This is something we see a lot in medieval treatises of armoured fighting. It gets in close, it gets in dirty. The left hand is often used to grab and to throw and grapple. It's like wrestling with a giant knife in your hand. That's how you should think about it. Like wrestling with a giant knife in your hand that you're aiming to stab into gaps where the armour isn't. So, great, good stuff. Let's carry on with the fight. So this is where I'm going to say possibly the opposite of what some people expect me to say. So a number of messages that came to me once this was shown on TV, and I'd seen it as well, were that, oh, did you see him? He was dual wielding. That's no good. In the books he's supposed to use a two-handed sword or whatever. And that he was dual wielding and one of the swords was a long sword. I don't care about that. Paulus Cal's treatise, for example, shows sword and buckler being a small shield, which is essentially dual wielding. You've got a weapon in each hand. And he shows it with a longsword in the right hand. The whole point of a longsword or a bastard sword is it can be used as a one-handed sword. So I have no issues with that. Do I have a problem with dual wielding? No, I don't. Dual wielding is, although it's not as popular in history and ethnographically as it is in modern films and TV, it did exist historically. It was done in Renaissance Italy. And, you know, if someone's fighting against multiple opponents, then you can see a situation where they might look for any advantage they possibly can. If we look at Talhofer, for example, we see Talhofer fighting multiple opponents. He has a messer, or essentially a type of falchion, in his right hand, and in his left hand he has a buckler and a dagger. Okay, so we can see historically in the 15th century, in the 16th century, people did do this kind of thing. So I have no problem with the dual wielding. I have no problem with the fact that one of the weapons being dual wielded is a longsword. Some people criticise the choreography. I'll be honest, in the grand scheme of things, movie choreography is always going to be movie choreography. It's never going to look quite like a real fight. And if it did look like a real fight, it'd probably be over really quickly and it'd be quite boring to watch. There are a few movies that have fights that look like real fights, but I suspect that that's not what most of the viewing public want to see of this particular fight. And it looks a bit fancy, it looks a bit flashy, and I have to say, Game of Thrones in general has really bad fight choreography, especially anything to do with the Sand Snakes or anything to do with Jaime Lannister. Those fights suck. This fight, I feel, raised the bar. It took it to another level. And whilst it's not how I would necessarily have done it myself, I think it's really good. I think it's well choreographed. I think the guy playing Sir Arthur Dayne seems to know what he's doing. He looks like he's used to using swords and moving them around, not like the actor who plays Jaime Lannister, who doesn't look like a swordsman at all. He looks completely cack-handed with a sword. So I thought this was fairly good and entertaining to watch. And I would liken it similarly, actually, to the fight between Red Viper and the Mountain. And I think that was a pretty good fight, pretty fun choreographed fight as well. Yes, it was kung fu wushu essentially. This has got a more kind of European fighting style feel to it, which is you'd expect given where they are and who they are. But I think it's pretty fun to watch. Anyway, let's stop talking and let's go back to watching it. Great little move there. You know, it was a series of semi-plausible fencing moves essentially, where he gets into a position where the blades are crossed. Now, incidentally, crossed blades does happen in historical systems, particularly in defensive motions where you'll cross the blades to defend and then keep one blade there to bind while attacking with your now spare blade. But here, again, we see attacking in a place where the armour isn't. This character is wearing a mail shirt, gambeson, coat of plates, so he's very, very heavily armoured actually on the torso, and then a helmet but nothing on the neck. So absolutely great, yeah. Arthur Dayne basically got into this position where he could present both edges to the neck. Scissors. Is it plausible? Would it cut? Yes, absolutely. Any one of those cuts would cut individually. They're not exactly cutting like scissors, okay? Don't think of it like that because they're not joined. But it's essentially 2 slashes at the same time. And absolutely you've got loads of veins up here, so yes, it would have, if not exactly that effect on most people, probably this person would stay conscious for longer and try and fight back. But nevertheless, for cinematic purposes, it works great. Let's carry on. So again here we have thrusting through 3 levels of armour, which I have a little bit of a problem with, because we can see the coat of plates there. You can just about see some mail of the male shirt sticking out here, and there's a gambeson, there's a bit of mail up there as well. So that, realistically, and there's no question he's not going for a gap, we can absolutely see the blade is going through plate, mail and padded armour. Not going to happen, okay? Even a lance would have problems to do that. A crossbow bolt or an arrow, possibly. I have myself shot arrows through mail and gambeson, no problem. However, add a coat of plates to it, not likely. Okay, so that, in my opinion, rather unrealistic, and it's a bit of a shame because they could have simply relocated that thrust up to the armpit, and then the thrust is only going through mail and padding, and that's a bit more plausible than actually straight through plate as well. Okay, so just a tiny little detail here, but interesting to note that Sir Arthur Dayne has changed his sword in his right hand, curiously, to being backwards facing. This is something that is beloved of various movies and TV. It's a very silly thing to do with a real sword. You can hold a sword point downwards for stabbing at close range, or indeed from horseback. It's shown in medieval art actually being used like a giant dagger against infantry as you ride past. But as a cut and thrust implement on foot, point down, it kind of makes the sword less useful than it would be point up. Yes, you can use a sword like this, but the problem is it greatly reduces your range. If you're holding something point up, you have the ability to stretch the blade out. If you're holding it point down, you don't really. You've got no strength behind it, okay? All you can really do are draw cuts and a stab that's somewhat like a dagger stab, which doesn't have anything like the reach of a conventional thrust. So really, holding swords point down, a bit of a no-no and a bit silly. You can use it as a parrying device, but why rob yourself of the ability to also strike back with it? Let's carry on with the fight.
Better than my father.
Far better.
My father beat him.
Did he?
No, he did. Heard the story 1,000 times.
Interesting detail there. Ned Stark actually blocked an incoming sword with the vambrace of his armour. Now, I've never really noticed before that he was wearing those, and if I did, I think they looked like they were supposed to be leather. Now, blocking a sword blow, certainly from a sharp sword, on just a leather vambrace, a little bit foolhardy. Would you do it if your life depended on it? Yes, of course. It's better to get hit in the arm than hit in the neck or the head. But as a deliberate thing, seems a bit strange. If, however, that is metal armour, then great. Because if a person's cutting at you and you have metal armour, iron or steel armour on your arms, yeah, just stick the arm in the way because it's not going to do anything. So I kind of like that they had the variety of putting that in there, that he doesn't just block with the sword all the time, that occasionally he blocks with the arm and hits back with the sword. That's kind of cool. Nice bit of choreography. And there we go, so we find out that essentially Ned didn't beat Sir Arthur Dayne. Actually, Howland Reed stabbed him from behind. There we go, that's fine. I actually really liked that twist. From a narrative point of view, I thought that was quite fun. And I also liked the fact that Sir Arthur Dayne remains the best swordsman, because he wasn't really beaten in the sword fight. What do I think about that last disarm? I don't know. It didn't look like a real disarm to me. Disarms do exist through swordsmanship systems right the way across the ages. However, that doesn't look like a disarm I've ever seen, and I'm not really sure that that would be a disarm. Also, you've got to bear in mind, assuming that Sir Arthur Dayne didn't mind killing Ned Stark, he didn't mind killing the other guys, if you're in a position to cross a person's blade and then and do something, manipulate their blade and do something to them, it would be far better at that point to essentially cross the person's blade and then, rather than disarming them, actually just cut their arm, disable their arm. But nevertheless, from a narrative point of view, I understand why they did it. They disarmed Ned to show that Ned had been completely defeated. So not like, we know that Sean Bean, whether it's going back to his days in Sharp or whatever, we know that he likes to get wounded but then come back fighting like Rocky. So it was kind of good in a way. They just disarmed him. There we go. What are you going to do now? You're against a guy with two swords. You've got no sword. So I think it was good. So my summing up of the fight was that I actually thought it was really good. I don't really understand why so many people that I see on the internet are kind of saying that it's rubbish. I've also seen a lot of people saying it's freaking awesome, but there's a surprising number of people, to me anyway, saying it's rubbish. When I first watched it, I thought, yeah, cool, there's some good stuff in there. First of all, it looks better than the average Game of Thrones fight. Secondly, they've got some variety in there, actually different types of moves. Thirdly, they've got helmets and cutting around armour, like thrusting in gaps in armour. Fantastic, that's not something you see on TV very often. But also, and above all, it was very clear that the choreography and the fighting abilities of the people in this scene was far better than the average of what we expect in Game of Thrones. So overall, I would say well done. For within the frame of reference of Game of Thrones, I would call this a 9 out of 10. Within the sphere of everything in the world on TV and film, I would call this probably a 7 out of 10, I would say. 7.5 out of 10. I'll give you an extra half. So I thought it was pretty good, and by the measure of Game of Thrones, I thought it was really good. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.